Let's get this shit started.
This is the Down and Dirty Dynasty Fantasy Football Podcast with your host, Nick Anderson.
What is up, Dynasty Degenerates? This is your host, Nick Anderson, with the Down and Dirty Dynasty Fantasy Football Podcast, or as y'all know it, the Triple DFFP. And y'all, I am so pleased to have Jake the Snake with us today, Jacob Vines. You can find him on Twitter at jsnake_DFF. What's going on, Jake? Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Excited to be talking some fantasy football, and it's a good Sunday. We're 3 Sundays away from football starting?
Yes, and I it's one of those things I want to, like, you want to go to bed early before Christmas morning so that the presents can just get there. I just want to go to sleep for 3 weeks, wake up, and have football. I'm so scared something's going to get ruined. I'm so scared it's going to get jinxed. I just want it to be here.
I think we'll start off strong. I'm not quite 100% convinced about a full season, but for me, like, if it's even 8 to 10 weeks, I'll be content.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it will certainly be interesting how the ends of – so, you're in a handful of leagues like I am, and honestly, I mean, I know that we've adjusted IR spots and all of that to account for COVID, but how are your teams accounting for the possibility of no end of the season? I mean, are you guys have any contingency plans in place for that?
So I commish 2 leagues, and so if the NFL plays more than 6 weeks, so 7 weeks or more, then we're going to count that as a full season. And then it's all going to be based off of points for until we reach the playoffs. And then if we reach the playoffs and it gets canceled, say week 14, week 15, then it will be the teams that are still contending who have the most points for the season and the playoffs. And I always think points for is a more fair way to look at how teams produce. And then it also makes it to where you can use the reverse order the max points for the playoffs, or not playoff, the rookie drafts. So you're not penalizing teams for scoring more points. Instead, they're getting some money. They're getting some cred for winning the league. But at the same time, the people who did worse, have the worst teams, also get those early draft picks.
Right. And that's the way that we do it in our leagues too. Is we're all potential points based, everything the accumulation of your team, what they score is what your end result is outside of the championship and all that. But so we are going to be talking. So why don't you tell them real quick what got you into fantasy football? If anybody isn't paying attention to Jake's Twitter right now, you guys should be. He has some of the best threads out there. His statistical analysis is second to none. And I mean, it seems like you kind of came up through the ranks at the same time that I did. It seems like we kind of had the same, starting point. And man, I mean, your grasp of statistical analysis and the way that you translate it into your threads is just so incredible to me. So tell us where that came from.
Well, I really appreciate that. I think for me, if we're talking about how I got started, it was more just I joined a couple of start 2 tight end leagues and got really into them and started thinking, how can you get an advantage in these leagues, or how should tight ends be valued? Because there's nothing about start 2 tight end. No one talks about it at all. And so I started digging into some Dynasty trade calculator values related to start 2 QB values to start 2 tight end values, and found some really interesting data with how Kittle and Kelsey should pretty much be the 1.01 and 1.02 of start 2 tight end, just based off of value alone. But There's also differences with the middle tier tight ends aren't going to be as valuable as a middle tier quarterback. So I didn't get perfect with it. I still plan on digging into some start 2 tight end stuff, but then also started looking into different players like Dallas Goedert, Antonio Gibson, and the Chiefs' amount of points for the running back. And received an opportunity to write with King Fantasy Sports. Great group over there. Really glad to write with them. Wrote an article about Alexander Madison. And that was before Dalvin Cook held out. And then I wrote an article about Sony Michel, and that was before he got surgery. And so it's been a weird run with articles, but now very gracious to be part of the Dynasty Nerds team, and now a Superflex ranker for them, as well as I have my own podcast, Snake in the Draft podcast. So it's been a weird run because I didn't start doing anything until May, but it's been fun. It's fun to interact, and I think with statistics, it's really just I have always enjoyed math. I think math just makes sense to me. And I would say there's definitely some people that have a better grasp of like the statistical models, but I at least try to encompass the full picture with stats. And I try to do that. I know sometimes people don't agree with how I do it, but I'm always grateful for any discussion to work on how I do it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I have no qualms with anything that you do. I'm so glad to have you. I mean, I write for Dynasty Nerds too, so it's awesome to be on the same team. So I mean, everything that you're doing right now, your podcast is great. The recent article that you just dropped on Dynasty Nerds, great. Statistical analysis, great. And that's the one thing that I love about this community is that there are going to be some assholes out there, but if you're making a misstep on stuff that you're putting out there, it's always such an opportunity to learn. I mean, there's so many things, so many facets in this that people are so experienced in that we can always be gathering more information. Like we don't know. I mean, we know like 10% of what the maximum amount of knowledge is to be able to know when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Always, like, if you're ever doing a thread or anything like that, just take whatever people say with think about it rationally how you would think about it. And I always try to defend my threads because I think it's important for other people to see your viewpoint and not just sort of hide behind the thread and actually get into a discussion. And I've actually seen myself grow and think, okay, I actually am not quite on my thought process in this, or no, I know I'm on the right thought process, and someone else may be a little bit more biased towards one player or another.
Right. Well, yeah. So, I mean, all that into consideration, we talked about how you got started up in this thing, and one of the things that we talked about when we were off screen about it is that one of your favorite teams, the Dallas Cowboys, and so because their offense is so full of fantasy potential, I decided that we just do a Cowboys talk today. We'd sit down and just go over their entire offense, A to Z, and see what's going on there, see who the values are, see where the future lies in some of these expensive and inexpensive dynasty assets. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right,
Love
man.
talking Cowboys. If anybody follows me, I'm not like a huge Cowboys fan like some people, but I grew up watching the Cowboys, and I think they're an exciting team to watch, and hopefully they can get it together this year. Hopefully.
Let's hope so. I mean, with the addition of, a CD Lamb, it's going to be hard to not succeed with that passing attack that they've got.
Yeah, CD Lamb is, man, whenever he was drafted to the Cowboys, I like felt my heart drop because it was just one of those picks that you were just like, man, that's going to be such a headache for a couple years.
But so let's start it off with, before we start getting into the players, let's just go over the new coaching changes that they have. They have new head coach Mike McCarthy, okay? And so when we're looking at where the Cowboys were in 2019 with their passing attack, with their air and out offense, they had a pretty balance. I think it was 55% passing to 45% rushing, I think is the ratio there. And it was top, I think it was like top 6 in the NFL. But a person who has had a much higher ratio in favor of passing is Mike McCarthy in that area. He's had, I think a 60-30 split on passing to rushing. And so, I mean, when we talk about coaching changes, obviously there's going to be some bumps in the road moving forward. But I think that this might actually, work in favor of the Dak Prescotts, in favor of the Blake Jarwins, of the Amari Coopers, Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb. What do you think about that?
That's an interesting take for sure. Coaching changes to me are always hard to sort of narrow down because, as I know you've mentioned this just now, it's so hard to see how much is it personnel based and how much is it their actual philosophy, because right. I saw some people talking about how, Mike McCarthy didn't use Aaron Jones, so Ezekiel Elliott's going to be used the same way and Tony Pollard's a buy, which I don't agree with that thought process because he hasn't had a running back like Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott's been awesome. So I could see it still being a little bit more pass heavy because Dak Prescott was really good last year. He was fantastic. They just added CeeDee Lamb. I could see them going more that way, but I don't see it going to where Ezekiel Elliott gets like a massive decrease in value and isn't worth that like running back 3 spot in Dynasty.
Right. And that's the one good thing about Zeke is that, I mean, even if we did see a little bit of a shift, I mean, we went from like what I think I said it was 55-45 last season. Even if we saw a 5% reduction in Zeke's opportunity share, I mean, honestly, I could see that just working in his favor, because Zeke is so talented. He's so model proof, I mean, the guy is an incredible athlete. one of the best that I've gotten to see the game. And so, I mean, I'm not worried about his value whatsoever with the addition of McCarthy. I do think, however, though, that it could open up some lanes for usage with this 3 wide receiver monster that we have on our hands here. And so let's go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I agree. That's 2020 to me is going to be a weird year for the Cowboys. And we'll get into this later, but I don't think CeeDee Lamb's going to be gets as much usage as some people expect, and it'll be more like a Michael Gallup, Amari Cooper show. Mm-hmm. But then 2021, I have no idea what to expect because there's just so many talented receivers, and you got CeeDee Lamb going his second year, Amari Cooper and Gallup. So Gallup's in a contract year, and then Amari Cooper's on his second year of a big contract. So it's going to be a headache for sure.
Yes, 100%. And so I've got some opinions on that, and we'll get to those soon. But first, let's start off with, you can't have a good offense. I guess you can. But the offense doesn't flow like you want it to if your quarterback isn't out there slinging the rock like you want him to. And so Dak Prescott finds himself in a very awkward situation moving into this season. They had contentious contract negotiations coming into 2020, and they weren't able to get any pen to paper on it, okay? And so moving into 2020, into the 2021 season afterwards, we're going to have to see where it lands with contracts. If Dak's going to be able to find himself a contract that fits his needs, or if he's going to end up having to go to a new organization after this year. I personally think that they're going to be able to get it done. I think that they're going to sign him, but there's always that looming possibility out there that something doesn't work, especially when you've got guys under contract like Amari Cooper, who's a favorable contract, but still a big one at that.
Yeah, I am very I think that Dak Prescott will get a contract. Like if we look at stats of QBs that ended up going to free agency, like the only person that's similar at all is like Kirk Cousins.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, but Dak last season even had like a better season than Kirk Cousins has had. Yep. And I know the Cowboys just barely missed the playoffs last year, but they have a new head coach, exciting team, and I would just argue that Dak is just the better QB overall. And I know some people may also be thinking about Peyton Manning whenever he went to the Broncos, but we need to remember that Manning also had back surgery just before that. So I still would keep Dak as my QB3 in DyNasty. He hasn't finished below a QB1 season his whole career. He was QB6 2016, QB11 2017, QB10 2018, and most recently QB2, and they just added CeeDee Lamb. So I love Dak.
Man, you're stealing my notes. I got my little stuff written on my notebook right here.
I got my notes on my computer too, so
that's exactly where I was going with it. I mean, there is not a quarterback in the NFL right now that has had more top 12 performances than Dak in the past 4 seasons. Now, we do have, Lamar Jackson, who showed up this year and is presumably going to be a top 12 quarterback for the next 4 seasons. Patrick Mahomes as well. But in the list of people that we have right now, nobody has done it in the past 4 years except for Dak, and Dak is 27 years old. I feel like people that are talking about Kyler up there over Dak, I just think they're missing the mark on it. I'm excited about DeAndre Hopkins' prospects out there, but the number of weapons and the production that we've seen out of Dak Prescott, both in his feet and in his arm, is, just great. If it weren't for Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes, who are just phenomenal in and of themselves, he'd be hands down the number one in this, like in fantasy rankings.
Yeah, and that's a great point with his legs, because a lot of people just think about Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray with the legs, but Dak Prescott was QB7 in rushing yards in 2019. It was QB8 in rushing touchdowns. And that's a nice floor that you'll want for your quarterbacks, especially if it's a 4-point per touchdown league. And then even if you go to a 6-point per touchdown league, Dak has, I think, an even larger advantage because he's getting the touchdowns. And I'd say his interceptions aren't crazy high for the amount of touchdowns he gets as well. And Dak's just a good pick.
He is, yeah. And so I do think that they're going to get some contract done. I saw some. Did you get to see the comments made by his dad? I didn't see the date on which this was made, but his dad was talking some mad shit, saying that this is why he was never a Cowboys fan. He doesn't know how long he's going to be able to root for the team since they weren't able to get a contract negotiation going. But we've seen people's dads pop off at the mouth where they shouldn't talk before. I think Brady's dad's been a victim of that as well. And so, you can't always take that for what it's worth, but it is an interesting little factoid when thinking of the future and if they'll get a contract synced up.
Yeah, one thing to remember is people were talking about how Dak wanted $40 million a year and thinking that's crazy. But I know with COVID, it's a little bit different with how the salary cap's going to change. But in a typical year after year, the salary cap increases. So that's why Patrick Mahomes' contract was structured the way it was because the team is only playing a certain percentage of the expected salary cap. And if Dak's getting $40 million in 3 or 4 years, that's going to be a less of a percentage than what it would be now. So that's important to remember.
Yes, very much so. And I do think that Dak might have been overestimating his value just a little bit. But in the general scope of things, what he's brought to the team, what he can bring to the team in the future, I think he's being somewhat reasonable. But let's move on from Dak. We'll go on to the guys that are receiving the ball from him. And man, this is a list. This is a murderer's row right here of offensive talent. We've got Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, and newly anointed 88 rookie CD Lamb, guys. So we'll start it off with the presumed number one in this offense. I know, Jake, you're going to take some exception to this because I saw your thread coming out the other day. But Amari Cooper, okay? Amari Cooper is signed for a 5-year deal, $100 million total, and he is signed through, I think is it 2023? I think he signed through. He had a 5-year deal. I think it's through 2023.
It's through 2024, but the team does have an out after 2021.
Yes, yeah. There's no guaranteed money after 2021, and I think that they take a $6 or $16 million cap hit if they did cut him after 21.
It's $6 million.
$6 million. There we go.
Yeah.
So knowing the contract that he's got, I mean, they paid the guy for what he's worth, but also they were tentative enough with the contract and made it, team friendly enough because we have seen Amari Cooper have these drop-off games. He's shown that he has elite talent, and he's shown that since he was like pick 1-4 in the draft, he's an elite talent, but he has fall-off games. And I think that's why they made this contract the way it is. He can either show up or he can show out,
Yeah, and you may have saw my thread this morning. It was like a very, very little thread, but let me ask you a question. Out of Kenny Golladay, Amari Cooper, and Allen Robinson, who had more games over 15 fantasy points in a PPR league in 2019?
Well, this is cheating because I already read your thread. but if I were to guess, I would say Kenny Golladay would be my guess on it.
Yeah, and one thing to say as well with this is they were all the exact same. I know Kenny Golladay didn't have Matthew Stafford for all 16 games, but we are dealing with the stats that we have. We can't extrapolate too much from the stats. So they all had the 8 games over 15 fantasy points, and then Amari Cooper and all of them also had 5 games over 20. And the reason I'm mentioning this is there was some talk by, I think it was Ryan McDowell posted a little post about wide receiver 1 weeks. And then someone mentioned to look at it more as like if a wide receiver scores above 15 fantasy points to make it more standard across a season.
Okay.
And with that, this sort of shows me that Amari Cooper, even though he has those super low weeks, is providing that wide receiver 1 value at a similar rate of everybody else.
Right.
And then also for going redraft, Amari Cooper is also being drafted at wide receiver 13, while Golladay and Robinson are going at wide receiver 8 and wide receiver 9, respectively.
And so, I mean, when you're looking at it from that standpoint, about a weak winner, somebody that's providing you that wide receiver 1, I mean, it does show where Amari Cooper, it holds that value at his, ADP 13 spot. The problem when we're looking at him, though, in my personal opinion on it, and 13, it's built in there, it's baked into the price when you get him at wide receiver 13, is that Golladay and Robinson aren't going to lose you a week. But Amari Cooper might end up losing you a week. So that's where we see some of the, fears and concerns that we have over the Amari Cooper, because we have seen his entire career. I mean, he has drop problems. He has just drop off the face of the earth problems. And so those are things that I worry about with Amari Cooper, especially when we're talking about, I'm sure that you've seen it as much as anybody else has, but Twitter just hypes up how accurate Derek Carr is, especially ramping up into the Scott Fishbowl selections, And so we see Amari Cooper having like a 55% catch rate coming from a hyper accurate Derek Carr. Makes me a little bit worried about his consistency, even though you have shown that he can do it, as much as the Allen Robinsons and Kenny Galladays can.
Yeah, that is a good point about drops, and that like last year alone he had 8 drops, and I know even Michael Gallup had his own issues with drops. So that could lead to a little bit of an opportunity for CeeDee Lamb this year, in that if he could start snagging the ball, he could do well that way. One thing that does help Amari Cooper to me is that he is in a high efficient offense, which leads to more chances for touchdowns. But at the same time, I also understand if people want to stay away and get people they feel that are safer, like a Kenny Galladay, like a Allen Robinson, because we've already mentioned it a ton of times on probably your podcast multiple times, my podcast a couple of times. Wide receivers so deep that you can decide who you want to take, who you think is the guy that you just want on your team.
Yep. You do have the ability, especially with, people going so running back heavy. If you're deciding to get one of these top tier guys, you can pick and choose from the litter, because I mean, it's almost a league standard at this point, even though there's still people beating the drum for 0 RB, that you draft running back, the first 2 to 3 rounds to be able to solidify that position in a shallower pool. But so there's a lot of good things that we've got for Amari Cooper. I mean, he's got the draft capital. He's in a high-scoring offense. He's the presumed number one. He's got the contract. He got paid already. So all of these things lend to the fact that Amari Cooper is a solid player. But he has to compete with the other two that we were talking about in Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb. So we'll go on to the more solidified of the two. We'll talk about Michael Gallup here, okay? So Gallup finds himself signed through 2021, which is when Amari Cooper's out is for his contract at the end of that season. So it is my opinion right now that one of the two of them won't be on the team after the 2021 season. Who do you think it's going to be that's going to be released?
If I had to choose, man, that gets tough, because you think about it, they keep Amari Cooper. That's a lot more money than probably what they pay Michael Gallup.
Right.
But then again, like, Amari Cooper is the number one. They traded a first-round draft pick for him. He was wide receiver 10 in PPR last year. So I lean more towards Michael Gallup going away, but it's a coin flip, because I just think, like we've talked about Michael Gallup on Twitter all the time, how he's undervalued because everybody's scared of CeeDee Lamb.
Right.
And if he can produce similarly to what he did last year and be at that similar level of Amari Cooper, then who knows what's going to happen going into 2021, because then everybody's like, well, they're like the same, but they're different by 5 rounds of value.
Yeah. And so I kind of think the opposite of that. I think that Cooper is going to be the one that departs the team. But like you said, I mean, it is literally a coin flip at this point. We're all just speculating. But the reason why I believe that is not so much a fantasy football standpoint, but more an actual football standpoint looking at it. Because Gallup had just one fewer game as a wide receiver 2 than Amari Cooper did. And he finished with, and this is coming from Pro Football Network, Philip Caldwell out there. We actually had him on the show. He has a consistency metric that he talks about. And Amari Cooper finished in his consistency metric at the 22nd wide receiver last season. And Michael Gallup found himself as the 31st most consistent wide receiver with with 2 fewer games under his belt. Okay. He had, I think it was like 3 fewer targets than Amari Cooper did over the course of the year, missing 2 games. So, I mean, it shows that he has a rapport with Dak Prescott. It shows that Dak wants to get him the ball. It shows that, honestly, in my opinion, the consistency between the two is negligible. I think that Amari Cooper holds that namesake value, and that's why he got the contract that he did. But oftentimes we see that name doesn't mean anything. It's production on the field. And I think that the production between Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup in 2019 wasn't drastic enough to be able to support the contract that Amari Cooper's receiving.
Yeah, that's an extremely valid point. I think if Gallup can decrease the amount of drops he's getting, which he had 3 more drops, actually had the most drops in the NFL, if he can decrease that number and be a more consistent option for Dak Prescott, where Dak Prescott isn't going to be worried about, oh, if I'm throwing it over here, is he going to catch it? Because his true catch rate was only 71% for Michael Gallup.
Yep. I mean, that's not great.
No. I know also Michael Gallup's more that field stretcher than Amari Cooper, so that is a factor with it. But if Michael Gallup can step up this season, start catching the ball, and then CeeDee Lamb step up as well, then I can see Amari Cooper walking, or not really walking, but getting cut.
Right. Yes. 100%. And apparently Michael Gallup was adopted, and so that's going to make it super fucking hard to find his A. I tried to Google Michael Gallup A. and it's just a bunch of articles about how he was adopted. So I'm going to have a little bit of trouble finding that right But so, yeah, I think that all those points are 100% valid on that. There are definitely pros and cons both with Amari Cooper and with Michael Gallup. The one thing about Gallup, not talking about the future of the Cowboys, not talking about him versus Amari Cooper, the thing with Michael Gallup, in my opinion, is that he is an absolute steal regardless, based off of his ADP right now in dynasty leagues and redraft leagues. I feel like he is kind of lumped in there with the grouping of the Christian Kirks and the Tyler Boyds that are the secondary options, the beta wolves out at their respective offenses. And I think that Gallup has arguably the highest ceiling of all of them for the lowest ADP, I believe.
Yeah, his ADP is super low. He was someone that I, at first, early on in the offseason, was concerned because of the CD Lamb effect. And then after thinking about it more and just looking at some projections by people like John Bauer, by David, I forget his Twitter handle, Wilson8 Tour, I think is what it is. But anyways, just a couple of people like that. And it's the amount of attempts that's going to happen by Dak Prescott. It's going to make it to where Amari Cooper can be a wide receiver 1. Michael Gallup can also be a middle tier wide receiver 2. And then there's still room for CD Lamb to be a wide receiver 3 and Blake Jarwin to be the tight end 12. Like, there's so much attempts and room for this that everybody that's nervous about Michael Gallup just needs to look at his price and be like, the odds of him increasing from his ADP, which he's probably going, wide receiver 40-ish, I would guess.
Around that.
Yeah, and I know it's like wide receiver 38, I think, in redraft, but you should grab him everywhere at that cost because you're wanting upside at those picks, and he has the upside, like you already mentioned.
Right. 100% agree on that. I'm going to try and log in here real quick. But yeah, I can't find. I don't have his ADP right up in front of me, but he's going down somewhere around there, and he's already outkicked his coverage on that. Last season, he already outkicked that coverage, and so the reason why people are fading him is because of the newly acquired rookie in CD Lamb, and so that's who we'll talk about next. And so, there are a lot of things that you can say about CD Lamb. Fucking impressive, awe-inspiring. So, I mean, some of the catches that you saw him make in college, that corner drill that he did at the combine where he was just showing off because he's that damn good. CD Lamb is the next generation of amazing talents in the NFL, in my personal opinion. But I don't think that he is going to be a hindrance to Michael Gallup or even Amari Cooper, especially in 2020. And the reason I think that is because CD Lamb in college, in his slot snaps in college, had 52 catches for 1,085 yards and 12 TDs. He can excel from the slot position. It's not something that's outside of his wheelhouse. He actually has the ability to play all over the field. And so right now, without a rapport with Dak Prescott, I think that he's going to fill the Randall Cobb spot in the slot snap position and slide right in there. Where Randall Cobb saw success last year in accompaniment with Gallup and Amari Cooper, I think that's going to be a lot the same in 2020.
Yeah, I agree. And everybody's talked about the rookies in general struggling because of COVID. And in general, rookie wide receivers do struggle. 2019 was a weird year for rookie wide receivers. And we shouldn't be surprised if CD Lamb and even Jerry Jeudy or anybody like that has a wide receiver 3 season because they're at a disadvantage already. And then they're just a rookie in general. So yeah, I agree. I don't see CD Lamb taking away Michael Gallup's upside in 2020. Now 2021, I think it depends on if you're more team Michael Gallup or team Amari Cooper, because the thought would be that one of them is going to be affected by CD Lamb after 2020, and that's what I'm expecting. And I think it'll be Michael Gallup, but you could also argue that CD Lamb has a more similar playing attributes to someone like Amari Cooper.
Right. And I think that I would probably lean that way to say that if we were gonna compare him to a wide receiver, I would make him more akin to an Amari Cooper. So I mean that might benefit Gallup or it might not. I mean I think that with all of this, I think that the future of this team, no matter what, is CD Lamb. And so the question is, who is going to be the most flexible moving forward? Who is going to be the one that is willing to, take that beta role, take a pay cut, take this and that? And I just think that Amari Cooper has gotten a little bit too big for his britches, and Gallup hasn't quite gotten there yet. And so that's why I'm hopeful And also, I've been burned by Amari so many times. I've been burned by this guy a bunch. All right. I drafted him on my rookie draft, so maybe I got a little bit of a fucking grudge going. But I think that Michael Gallup has the ability to be able to be flexible and pliable and all those things to be able to be the beta to the anointed number 88 in Dallas, which means something. The fact that they're giving him that number means something. And so they're going to need somebody who's willing to take a backup role to him. And I don't know if that's Amari.
Yeah, and another point, just talking about dynasty in general, is if you're just looking at risk, you have Amari Cooper going as a wide receiver 1 drafted, Michael Gallup's a wide receiver 3 drafted. Who is going to be hurt the most from a change in scenery? Most likely Amari Cooper.
Right.
I mean, I'm not as high on DeAndre Hopkins, and he changed scenery, and that's the main reason. Is it's a combination of COVID and changing scenery. I know he's super talented, but it's risk. And
Right.
if Michael Gallup changes scenery, he can, I think, still be a wide receiver 2 in fantasy football and easily be a wide receiver 2 on the actual football team.
Right. And I honestly hadn't even thought about that point, talking about insulating yourself from the risk, of a possible departure from these guys. But yeah, I mean, if you were talking about which risk is lessened, it's certainly Michael Gallup, because he has the ability to fill in at the exact same role that he's been playing right now. So when we're talking about this, I mean, Amari Cooper, he has shown that he has the ability to be able to be a wide receiver 1 at the same rate as some of the elite talents that are being drafted above him. But we see some pitfalls in his game where he falls off, bad catch rate, all of those things. So it's kind of, it's the scales of justice here. You're trying to balance the great games with the not so great games. And then we talk about Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup is the beta wolf who we think is still going to succeed in 2020 in this offense. We think that he's going to have a lot of the same production as last year. And if he can get his catch rate up, we think there's a chance that he might be able to be the one that stays after 2021 in this Cowboys offense. On to CeeDee Lamb. He is the next in a long line of great Dallas wide receivers. And, he's going to be the future on this team. But I think that he's going to be relegated to the slot role in 2020, where he's perfectly capable of producing because he's just that talented. So of the wide receiver core, you got anything to add on that?
I just wanted to add, I know I talked about the risk related to Gallup and Amari Cooper. I still like Amari Cooper as a wide receiver 1 drafted. I think in that team, he can still produce there. And if we look at the contract alone, he's getting paid. Even if he gets cut, he'll still be a wide receiver 1 on a team. There just is more risk versus Michael Gallup, who is going as a wide receiver 3 with wide receiver 2 production.
And how old is Amari right now? Is he 26?
I can find that in 2 seconds. Yeah, 26.
Yeah, 26.2 years old. And so, I mean, if we're talking about the end of the 21 season, so we're talking about, 27, 28 years old, depending on when his birthday falls. And that's a lot of meat left on the bone for a guy like that. And so, I mean, honestly, if he goes and finds himself in a different setting, it might be more favorable to him. You might not have to fend off, the Michael Gallups or the CeeDee Lambs. And so, I mean, at that 13 spot, still not bad. Young, talented, production, and has the ability to either be on a high-flying offense or a new home with less competition, because I don't think there are many places that has more competition in the NFL.
Agreed. Yeah. The wide receivers are just stacked in Dallas.
Yep. I mean, if we were talking about a wide receiver core, I would rather have their wide receiver core, I think, as that threesome than I would the Tampa Bay offense. Just saying that right now. The threesome of those guys over Evans and Godwin, I think I'd take those as an actual offensive team, if I was to choose it.
I think you could argue Cowboys over Chiefs as an offensive team.
Oh, I don't have any qualms with that. I mean, the Kelsey addition makes it a little bit of a maverick right there, because he is so much better than Jarwin, who we're going to talk about next. But if we're just talking about the wide receivers as a whole, I mean, Gallup over Sammy Watkins, CeeDee Lamb over Mecole Hardman. I mean, I'm not going to argue Amari over Tyreek, because Tyreek's my boy. I mean, I got here. But yeah, as a whole in the receiving core, easily Cowboys over Chiefs. So let's move on to Blake Jarwin, the up and coming tight end for the Dallas Cowboys. Now, this is a guy that I was a little late to the party on him. People started really getting some buzz going at the end of last season, And I kind of didn't understand it. He wasn't somebody that I had seen a bunch of tape on. So I was looking strictly at the numbers, and I was looking at the season end total as opposed to game logs, And so with that, and not thinking about, having a, oh, I'm sorry, um, not having a number one tight end in front of him, I wasn't really that excited about Jarwin. But the more that I dug in, the more that I see that he has some potential in 2020. He had 31 receptions last year for 365 yards and 3 TDs, but that was all seated behind an inferior but preferable to coaches Jason Witten. So what do you think about Jarwin's 2020 outlook?
Darwin is one of those guys that it's hard for me to just see exactly how much work he's going to get, because we're talking about CeeDee Lamb, super talented first round receiver, and I know I mentioned and you mentioned we don't expect CeeDee Lamb to take much from Michael Gallup, but I could see him taking a little bit from the tight end role, and he has potential. But with how deep the tight end landscape is this year, I find it difficult for him to be a tight end one, because I don't think it'll be the same as last year with Witten being tight end 11 in 2019. And also one thing that was super interesting that at Mike Me Up posted on Twitter, and it was about looking at tight ends from a different lens, and it was redefining the tight end one as a top 5 tight end,
Yes.
and look for tight ends that have that top 5 upside. And I do not think that Jarwin has that type 5 upside. I would say like someone like a Kelsey Kittle, Mark Andrews, Zach Ertz, Ingram, some more surprising names, maybe TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant, Irv Smith Jr., Waller, Hunter Henry, Austin Hooper, Higbee Smith, Hayden Hurst. I think all of those guys have top 5 upside. I'm obviously a little bit skeptical of Hooper, Higbee, Smith, and Hurst, but I would take those guys over Jarwin. And I know they are going there. So there is an ADP argument for Jarwin, but I'm skeptical. Goodness, I can't speak.
But yeah, you were talking about, you see, and I'm glad that you clarified on that, because I think you and I saw the same tweet on that. But you were talking about, tight end one, and tight end one is such an arbitrary, classification, because you can have a 7-point differential between, the tight end 11 and tight end 16. It gets really, really clustered down there at the bottom, and the point spread just isn't that significant. So, yeah, it's great to say, I had a tight end 1 last year, but if you're only getting 6 more points on the entire season, then it doesn't make any bit of difference. And so when we talk about the guys with upside, I do not believe that Jarwin does have that upside. I don't think that it's within his wheelhouse, unless there's just unless he pops off the goddamn page this year. I don't think that he has that in his wheelhouse. But I do think that he has the ability to be able to beat the people that are being drafted in front of him. I think that he has the ability to put up, like a 650 season with, 5 or 6 touchdowns. Because last year there was 190 vacated targets between Randall Cobb and Jason Witten coming out of that offense. If we relegate, which would be insane if we gave this to CeeDee Lamb, but 100 targets to CeeDee Lamb, which would be a ton for a rookie wide receiver. If we were to give 100 targets to CeeDee Lamb and give 90 to Blake Jarwin, I mean, he's gonna be hard pressed to not be a tight end 1.
Yeah, and one thing too is like if we're talking dynasty, like I would trade Rob Gronkowski straight up for Blake Jarwin. Like first of all, I don't trust Rob Gronkowski. I think everybody getting into the hype and thinking about him being this elite guy from 2 years ago or 3 years ago with all his injuries and stuff. I'm not on that train. And yeah, it's super interesting because you look back at like Witten's numbers when he was producing, like back in the good old days, like 2019 he was tight end 5, he's 2010 he was tight end 1 and all this, and then even like 2017 he's tight end 9. And so it gets to where if he can get the 90 targets and he can produce with that, he can get into that tight end 8-ish range, which is an excellent spot for like tight end streaming, which you can always argue that Blake Jarwin is like the perfect like second tight end to get on your team to stream tight ends if you don't have an elite guy, or to play during bye week.
Yep, and I think that he's seated right at the position where you can nab him as your tight end 2 in a dynasty startup. And that would just be, I mean, that's the ideal player right there for that tight end 2 position. Somebody like him, somebody like a Jonnu Smith, one of those players that has a little bit of buzz around them, but hasn't had the production yet to be able to solidify them with a higher ADP. And that's where I find Blake Jarwin at right now. I have heard, and I got to be honest with you, I haven't gotten to break down his film study all that close. I've gotten to look at a lot of stuff for the Dallas Cowboys, but I haven't gotten a chance to sit down and break down Blake Jarwin. God, that's a tongue twister. But everybody that I've heard that has gotten to analyze his film say that he looked phenomenal last season. They say that the only reason, because I know a lot of people are going to make the argument that Jason Witten out-touched him last season, but we have all seen entrenched coaches give carries and targets to inferior players because they have a familiarity with them. And there's something to be said about that. I mean, Jason Witten was going to catch every goddamn ball you threw his way, but he was going to go down the minute that he caught that ball. He was getting 0 yards after catch, but he was getting you the first down. And so, I mean, there was no question in my mind that the superior tight end last season was Blake Jarwin, and that he will be the recipient of the bulk of Witten's targets from last season. And if he can get that, I think that he definitely, you were talking about tight end, like the tight end 8, I think he's got that firmly in his wheelhouse. I just don't think that he can raise up to tight end 5.
Yeah. It's always frustrating whenever we look back. And for me, like, I'm very much into stats, like you already mentioned before. And like one team that is really frustrating for me is the Chargers, because we have no data on the Chargers without Phillip Rivers for the last 4 years. And so that to me is just really frustrating as someone who likes stats. And I know that I have a blind spot with film. That's one thing I haven't looked into. It's one thing that I'm excited with, like the DyNasty Nerds film room, getting into that, watching some YouTube videos.
Their film room is phenomenal.
Yeah, and it's just like, if anybody's one side or the other, get it on both. Like one person that does a great job is Jetpack Galileo on Twitter with the FF astronauts. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, fantasy football astronauts. Yeah.
Yes, and like, he does a good job of breaking down both ways, and I think that's important, because you don't need to just be one way or the other, because you'll miss out on some people. And it's good to see both sides. And I don't know anything about the film, but I could 100% believe that Jason Witten, who had 6.37 yards per target, was not looking as good as Blake Jarwin, who had 8.9 yards per target. That makes sense to me.
Exactly. And I mean, and I don't ever try and tout myself as a statistician, as a film analyst, any of those things. I'm kind of just a moron who has some good opinions and some really bad opinions on fantasy football. I played college football at Missouri Western, so I'm a little bit familiar with, analyzing offenses. I was an outside linebacker there. So, I mean, I know a little bit of what to look for, but in terms of, route running and all that stuff, I know it from the defensive perspective. I don't know what to exactly, like, oh, that stem was killer right there. He stacked that guy up. Those are all things that I can see that I'm learning, especially from following the DyNasty Nerds film room on Twitch. If you guys get to go watch that, you can learn a ton of stuff from those guys. And I learn every single time that I watch it to add on to the database that I already had of information. And so that, accompanied with guys like you, guys like Blake Hamilton, that I get to follow and see their statistical breakdowns, I learn something new every day. But so, Jarwin, superior tight end in 2019, but didn't get the looks. I think 2020 is going to be his opportunity to get the looks. And I think that from what I've heard about his film study, he has the ability to be able to do it. It's just one of those questions of, is it going to happen? There's a lot of mouths to feed out there, a lot of pieces that have to fall in the right spot for him to be as productive as he can be. But me and Jake agree that he has top tight end 8 upside. So let's move on to the final piece of the offense, which is going to be a pretty easy one. I like to have softballs at the end, Let's just talk about this guy, Zeke Elliott. I don't know much about him. I don't know who he is. New name on the scene. But, I mean, Zeke is going to be an absolute monster. And I have a hot take that people don't like. Nobody likes it. But I take Zeke above Saquon in DyNasty. And I do it every single time, and I do it with a smile on my face. What do you think about that, Jake?
I can definitely see the reasoning behind it. I still lean Saquon, but to fuel your point of Zeke over Saquon, in points per game over the last 4 years, Zeke has finished as the RB3 in 2016. And this is point per game. RB3 in 2017, RB6 in 2018, RB5 in 2019. Like, that is an insane amount of consistent production that we don't normally see. Like, the one person that's been producing over the last couple of years so far is Christian McCaffrey, tight end or running back 2 and running back 1. I don't know about points per game, but we saw Saquon running back 1 in points in PPR in 2018, but then 2019 got hurt. And now I guess he does have Jason Garrett. That may be a beneficial thing for him. But I wouldn't fault anybody for taking Zeke too. Now, if people start taking Zeke over Christian McCaffrey,
Right.
that gets crazy to me.
See, my problem is, and I know I have talked to, some of the best in the industry that are doctors and have talked to me about this. I am worried about Saquon's ankle injuries. I know that there's only been one in the NFL that we've seen so far, but it's his third high ankle sprain and the same ankle that he had through college and the NFL, and he's only got 2 years in the NFL right now. And so a bunch of the medical professionals that I speak to and all that stuff say that they are not particularly worried about it at this point. But the question that I keep posing that nobody seems to want to answer is, if we have a fourth one in that ankle, are we then worried about it? If he gets one more high ankle sprain, are we concerned about the stability of that ankle? Because as far as I understand, sprains begot other sprains. It makes instability in the joint. And so we're looking at Zeke. I just think Zeke is sturdy. He's rock solid. You know what you get with him year in, year out. And I think that we're going to see more of that in 2020. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And Zeke got paid too. That's an important thing to remember, that Zeke has the money behind him. I'm trying to look up real quick how long until Saquon Barkley is under contract, because I feel like they're pretty similar. But real quick, before I start looking too far, there's a great thread by Luke Neuendorf, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Yeah. He actually came on Snake in the Draft podcast, and we talked about the thread and that, like, the RB age, RB's aging and how everybody wants to sell after they're 25. That's not necessarily shown as true as you may think. And they could be 28 and still producing. 29 gets a little iffy from what I'm remembering, but that's another 3 years. And we've talked about in DyNasty, 3-year windows is typically what we say, because we don't know what's going to happen with changes in situation. Like, no one would have guessed last year that DeAndre Hopkins would have been traded for pretty much David Johnson, right? Like, no one would have guessed that.
B.O.B. breaks all statistical models. Nobody can predict what that man's going to do.
Yeah, and then, okay, so I have the contracts up, and so Zeke is under contract until 2024. The team does have an out after 2021. It's a $6 million in dead cap, but Zeke's contract isn't that bad for running backs, honestly, especially with how much Christian McCaffrey got paid.
Are you sure that he's signed through 2024?
Oh, is that Amari Cooper? No.
Yeah.
So I have him, 2024.
I thought it was 2026 that he was signed through.
Or no, you are right. 2026 with no dead cap after 2024. You're completely correct.
I was going to say, I thought it was farther out than that. Yeah, because he got a 6-year deal this year.
Okay. Yes. And then, like, Saquon, 2021, and then he's going to either be re-signed after that year or he's going to be on a new team. I would expect him to be re-signed, but I've mentioned my concerns about the 2021 free agent running back class of Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, Dalvin Cook. Like, it gets ugly whenever certain people end up being free agents. Like, if Kareem Hunt becomes a free agent, I know we're going off on a tangent, I don't see him becoming a starter anywhere. I don't.
Right.
Like, there's so many talented running backs.
The only there are a handful of places that, yes, I do think that he would be a starter at. If he went to Washington, if he went to Seattle, I think that I have no question that he would beat out everybody there. There are a handful of places that I think that he would walk in and take the starting job. But as a whole, the NFL is as deep as it's ever been with the running back position.
Yeah, I guess I should preface that I don't expect a team to sign him to be the starter, except for if he's wanting a cheaper deal than I'm expecting. If he's wanting a cheap deal, and if he goes to the Seahawks or Washington, I think Washington would be a really interesting pickup by them, because I could see them getting a running back in the second round next year. But anyways, going back to Zeke Elliott, I like him. I think he's my running back 3 in DyNasty. He's an excellent running back. I wouldn't be fading him or anything because of age.
Yes, I completely agree. But also, going back to the tangent, I think that Kareem Hunt is going to be the one. I think, in my personal opinion, he is going to be the focal point for offenses this offseason. I think that him above, if Dalvin Cook doesn't get a contract, if Joe Mixon doesn't get a contract, if Alvin Kamara doesn't get a contract, I think that Kareem Hunt, for the savvy owner, is going to be the target. Because at the end of this year, you know that Kareem Hunt is going to have inferior numbers to all of those players, and he has the baggage of his history weighing him down, which means that he is inevitably going to have to accept a lower contract than all of these other guys. And so I think that the savvy owner is going to look for him.
That is a good point because, yeah, the baggage is one thing that's definitely going to weigh him down, and he won't be having as good numbers. And, yeah, if a team can get him for relatively cheap, and I don't think anybody will get any backlash anymore with everything.
No,
so
not at this point.
Yeah, that's a good call.
So then let's move on to the final piece of this offense. Man, we really hitting it. We're hitting it on a low at the end here. But let's talk about Tony Pollard here, okay? So we've got Tony Pollard, the backup to Ezekiel Elliott, who is the three, arguably the two dynasty asset in the dynasty running back, landscape. So he is solidified as the backup to Ezekiel Elliott. Is he a more valuable asset than an Alexander Madison to you, with an unstable player in front of him like Dalvin Cook?
He is not. I'd rather have Alexander Madison over Pollard, but there's not really any other handcuffs that I could say are bounds above Pollard other than that, because the reason I like Madison is Dalvin Cook has had injury histories with his shoulder, and if anybody follows at FB Injury Doc, he talks about how it can lead to a 50% chance that Dalvin Cook will re-injure that shoulder and miss games. Yep. So that makes me like Madison more versus we already talked about Zeke. He hasn't missed a game in his career that wasn't his own suspensions and stuff like that. Zeke is as stable as it comes. Tony Pollard could possibly be a sneaky flex play when needed, but I wouldn't be expecting a ton.
Yeah, and I would never expect any value out of him if Zeke is still in the starting position. But I was curious because in terms of, offensive scheme, offensive line, all of those things are what makes Zeke and could make Tony Pollard because he is in and of himself a very, very good running back that has potential to do well in the NFL if given the opportunity.
Yeah, speaking of a stat, he was 5th in yards created per touch last year, which I know it was less touches than a lot of running backs, but still number 5 is an excellent thing to see in the NFL. And if for any reason Zeke goes down, Tony Pollard launches into, I would say, RB1 contention on a weekly basis.
Yep. I mean, all the guys, Alexander Madison does that. I mean, Kareem Hunt clearly does that. We are in a situation where we were talking about earlier about how deep the talent pool is at running back. That doesn't just extend to the starters. The backups are becoming more and more talented in this league as we go forward, I mean, we saw in San Francisco last year, they had a 3-headed beast that was able to produce at any given moment. We are in a very, very beneficial time for fantasy football players and a very, very disadvantageous time for actual skilled NFL running backs because you can be great and find yourself seated behind a baller.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking of Kareem Hunt, I would want Hunt over those two because I think he has some standalone, and I think you would agree with the standalone value. Yeah, Tony Pollard, it just sucks because you have him on your team. And one thing that JJ Zacharyson has talked about is, like, if you own Zeke, don't get Tony Pollard, get Alexander Madison. And if you own Dalvin Cook, Alexander Madison sort of, I think Dynasty is a little bit different, but if it's redraft, I would go Tony Pollard because you want to spread your assets over multiple teams.
Well, and so that's conventional wisdom in and of itself right there because you always want to diversify your assets. You don't want to put too many of your eggs in one basket. But even more in a COVID-ridden landscape, I think that that's huge because these running backs flock together. They're in the same film rooms. They grab the same balls that are being handed off to them. So if you have, Dalvin Cook that goes down to COVID, the odds of Alexander Madison getting it as well are huge. I mean, through the roof. But he has no effect on Tony Pollard, or somebody like that. So, I mean, you want to diversify your assets in these handcuffs so that you're not getting wiped out across the board if something happens to an offense.
Yeah, COVID's going to throw a wrench in everything. And I saw it was an article about how quarterbacks are going to stay separated, which I think is important to know and makes me like someone like Andy Dalton as a good handcuff for Dak Prescott versus before my thoughts were you don't want the handcuff of the team because they're all together. And I think running backs is an example of them all being together. Mm-hmm. And if if there starts going to be some breakouts where 4 or 5 teams are getting hit hard, I don't expect an NFL season to continue. So if anybody's worried about tons of teams getting hit, I think it's just going to be that one unlucky team, maybe 2. And if it gets more than that, then we're all in trouble.
That is interesting to hear about the quarterbacks, though. I hadn't heard that they were keeping them separated, and that kind of makes me a little bit cautious. I mean, without being too reactionary to a fact that I just heard, it makes me a little bit more cautious about somebody like a Herbert or a Tua, somebody that is slated to sit behind another quarterback for at least a handful of games. I don't know if Tua's gotten the nod to start yet or not, but those couple weeks, the training camp and those couple weeks that they get to grow and develop as a quarterback are vital, especially for a guy like Herbert, who's super, super raw. And so if he's not getting that opportunity, I think that would suck for his growth and really hinder him.
Yeah, I think it's team by team because, I mean, I saw a picture or a video of Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love throwing the ball back to each other. So I'm not really sure because it was for, I don't remember what team it was exactly. Maybe it was the Cardinals that they said that, but it's one of those things with the NFL that we've seen with like the Saints saying they're going to do like a little voluntary bubble and stuff like that. Like I think it depends team by team. And I could see some teams really screwing themselves by not really thinking hard about how they're going to keep everybody separated if they don't want to have to quarantine. Because from what I just understand, if you're in contact with someone who gets COVID, you either, I guess you could get a negative test, but then there's risk with that as well if you test positive.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the one thing that you're missing here is that Rodgers is a real motherfucker, and so I think he's throwing the ball with Jordan Love, saying, "If I get COVID, you're getting COVID too, bitch, because you're not getting my starting spot anytime soon." So that's my theory on that. They might be trying to keep them separated, but Rodgers just isn't listening.
That could be true. Yeah. I put Rodgers up there with like Tom Brady and like spitefulness and stuff. And yeah, having a chip on their shoulder.
Well, I think that's a good way to bring this to a close. Jake, thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate you. You have so much information to impart upon people. Why don't you tell them once again where they can find you and everything?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at jsnake_DFF. You can also follow my podcast or check it out, Snake in the Draft Podcast, also at SNTD Pod on Twitter. I also write for Dynasty Nerds, and my Superflex rankings are also on Dynasty Nerds if you're a Nerd Herd member. So come check out Dynasty Nerds, and also come chat with me on Twitter. Love talking on Twitter.
Nope, 100%, man, and he is always responding. Always out there. His articles, his threads are second to none, and the podcast is a great listen to. So make sure that you guys jump over there and subscribe. And if you haven't yet, make sure that you guys hit like, share, and subscribe down below on the Triple DFFP. And, just keep coming back for quality content like this. I hope you guys like our takes, but if you don't, fuck it, because I'm drunk.